Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Maybe we can just wait one more minute to see if a little bit of latecomers join us, if that's okay. We'll be right back.
I love defining latecomers as someone that's 1 minute late.
Good morning. Is there someone welcome to CHNRI, North Carolina for Nursing Network Violence Against Women International in June?
Thank you so much. If you'd like to share any information via the chat also, if there's a link that you'd like to provide, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. So should we get started? Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Alessandra Guedes, and I'm joining you from UNICEF's Office of Research in Florence, Italy. And we have a intense agenda for our half hour together. We wanted to thank you very much for joining us. I'm not sure how this was done in the morning session, but rather than take time for everybody to introduce themselves or even the team, I'm just going to say that probably the top row in your screen with Mark, myself, Anik, Liz, Abby, hi. Where is everybody else? Okay, and Shanice, right? I see you, Shanice. That we are the team behind the initiative that we're going to be telling you a little bit more about today. And so, without further ado, the idea for this conversation is to share with you a process that together UNICEF, WHO, and the Sexual Violence Research Initiative are undertaking to develop research priorities at the intersections of violence against children and violence against women. And you may be familiar with a global shared research agenda that was launched a few months back by the SVRI and the Equality Institute that focused on research priorities for violence against women. This process builds and complements that and looks specifically at what are the learning gaps that we need to be filling to address the intersections between violence against children and violence against women. And together, the SVRI, UNICEF Innocenti, and WHO are guided by an advisory group that has colleagues representing all of the regions in the world. But it's really our goal that the process be as participatory as possible. And so in addition to this smaller advisory group, we have created this group of experts, including yourselves, that will be able to weigh in at different points in the process. And so what we want to do today is to let you know what the process looks like, how far we've come so far, so that when we come back to you with requests that you'll hear more about, you'll have this background and you will be knowledgeable about how the process works. And as colleagues are going to be talking about the methodology and give you an update, please feel free to include in the chat any questions that you may have, and we'll come back to the questions at the end. So again, we know that you're super busy and we're so grateful for your time. And I will hand over now to Mark who will tell us a little bit more about the methodology that we're using. Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much, Alessandra. I'm just trying to find my slides here. They were here a second ago. Can you see those slides?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for your time. And in honor of that, I'm going to try and be very quick. I'm aware that many of you do know something about the CHNRI approach to research priority setting, and so I'm going to go through it very rapidly. And obviously, if there are any questions or anything, or like any materials, then please be in contact with myself or anyone on the team, and I'm happy to share. Essentially, at its core level, is that CHNRI developed based on a realization that prior to that, and CHNRI is heading for, you know, sort of 20 years old now already, is that prior to that, very often priority setting exercises were, they existed. There were many of them. They were often guided by the Delphi approach, and the Delphi approach has now morphed into something quite different. But at the time, it was often people sitting in a room, often powerful research interests, researchers. You know, people were chosen because they published, you know, 30 times in the Lancet, and they sat together, made a whole lot of decisions. And even within that powerful group, the really powerful members of that group had pretty much an undue influence on the outcomes. And really importantly is that the outcomes would be published, and it wasn't clear how they had been arrived at, that the process wasn't transparent. So the CHNRI method was developed in order to deal with that very particular issue of a system of trying to develop a process which was more democratic, where different judgments, whether it's the technical group or whoever you're approaching to score, to generate questions, their views and judgments are treated equally. So no one person can dominate. It considers a view of multiple stakeholders, and it's not just technical experts. The methodology based on something called the wisdom of the crowds, and if there's time, I can tell you about that. But it's the idea that if you get enough views of people together, every individual person doesn't have to be an absolute technical expert, because often that was almost a criteria for entry into these priority setting exercises. You know, if it was on research, well, you had to have done 5 randomized controlled trials. CHNRI said, no, that's not the case, because it's not just about method. It's also about feasibility. It's also about appropriateness of the research on the ground. It's also, will this research be valuable to people who are actually doing the implementation? And their views are as important, even if they don't always have exactly the same level of technical expertise. So that was the underlying philosophy, if you will, of CHNRI. One of the things that is really important in CHNRI is the criteria by which you score, rank, rate research options. So, for example, is it a question that in fact is even answerable? And this links to, for example, the time frame. So if you say the time frame of a research process is 2 years, and the question is, will we have a 100% effective HIV vaccine in 2 years? The answer is probably very likely to be no. Whereas if it's a 30-year time frame, the chances go up much, go up. So, and these are some of the criteria that have been used in exercises over the last 20 years. And part of the exercise here, and I'll tell you about the process just now, the timeline, will be to decide on what the criteria will be for the actual scoring of the research options. Once we have a set of research options, and I'll talk in the timeline about how we'll get to that, but basically there'll be a manageable group of potential options, and you and many more people will be asked to then score them. And it's a simple scoring process of yes, no, I don't know. And in fact, you can also leave it blank. The idea being that if you've got enough people, that will even it out. It'll average it out, and that's perfectly legitimate. And it results in a priority score of between 0 and 100. Some of the advantages, and this is quite important. As I've said, it measures the collective optimism of this group of technical experts. And technical experts is probably the wrong word, because people may not see themselves as a technical expert. They may be an implementation or a advocacy or a policy person, but they've always got some kind of technical knowledge in their area of expertise. One great thing about this is that the advantages and disadvantages of each option are quite transparent, so that at the end of the scoring process, one can look and see, well, this is the research option that's now got to the top of the list, as it were. But in fact, while it scores very high on these 3 criteria, it actually didn't do as well on equity, for example. And a funder, a donor can look at that and say, you know what, like equity for me is utterly key. I like the high answerabilities, but in fact, the questions 3, 4, and 14 do sufficiently well on answerability, but I really like the equity. So, and because it's transparent, because it's democratic, it allows decisions to be taken, by donors, funders, organizations, with just that little bit more information. As I said, it limits personal biases and really does, in a very effective way, prevent a few individuals from dominating. And it also presents a simple quantitative outcome. So there's a score, which, even though it's quite simple and we know it's more complicated than that, it does allow certain conversation to happen. And a final point, obviously, is that sometimes the difference in scores between 1 and 10 may not be very much. But again, because you can disaggregate, it allows that much more information to be used in making decisions. And now I'm going to hand over to Anik, who's going to take you through the domains for this research priority setting exercise. Anik.
Thanks so much, Mark. The coordinator group, together with the advisory group, reviewed 2 systematic reviews on this topic, one on the risk factors and co-occurrence of violence against women and violence against children, most particular intimate partner violence and child maltreatment in the home. And the second one was on interventions that address both types of violence. And based on this, we were able to better understand what the key gaps are in the field. And then we're able to define broad themes or umbrellas under which we think the research questions could be organized. Once we get the research questions, which is the next step, and Mark will talk more about that, we will go back to see whether these domains still work, or whether they need to be revised, reviewed, or reworked in any way. But for now, this is where we have landed. So the first domain is on strengthening our understanding of the intersections. And this will include gender-sensitive research to understand the different intersections across multiple forms of violence against women and violence against children, including types, frequency, severity, prevalence, incidence, nature, and impacts of, pathways between, and risk and protective factors associated with the co-occurrence of this violence across the life course and generations. The second domain will focus on intervention and services research, which will include research on programs, interventions, and services that prevent and or respond to both violence against women and violence against children, including building understanding of when and how interventions to prevent or respond to both forms of violence work, and when coordinated or integrated interventions are not recommended and why. The third domain is going to focus on tools, methods, and measurement. So this would include research that will identify new and innovative ways to measure intersections of violence against women and violence against children, challenge hierarchies of knowledge, encourage practice-based learning and participatory approaches, and address ethical issues and strengthen monitoring and evaluation of interventions in ways that investigate outcomes that are relevant to both forms of violence. The fourth domain is going to look at coordination and collaboration across sectors. This would include research into challenges and facilitating factors and coordination and collaboration across sectors at multiple levels, as well as research that provides insights into shared language, common values and principles, and helps to address thorny issues, such as mandatory reporting, parental alienation, etc., which often impede collaboration. And the fifth domain is policy research. And this would include research questions that will help us to better understand policies, including how they address the intersections, how they influence governance and delivery of services, and what impacts they have. Thanks, Mark. Back to you.
Thanks, Anik. So that's where we are currently. The next step is for the coordinating group and the advisory group to settle on those criteria that I mentioned earlier. So will it be answerability, feasibility, and equity, or a different combination? And that will be done relatively quickly because we need to get to the next stage. Following that is that we will then send out to all of you, those of our groups of people who attended the earlier meeting today, as well as a larger group of I think of about 450 that the coordinating advisory group has generated. You'll all be sent a SurveyMonkey form, and you'll be asked to generate questions within those 5 domains. The 1 to 30 questions, as I said this morning, we've reduced that somewhat because we worked out that if everyone did send 30 questions, which would be highly unlikely, but if they did, we'd have 13, 14,000. So we're going to ask for 3 questions per domain. It can be 1 question per domain, but we're going to ask for that. And importantly, and I think really in the spirit of the transparency, in the spirit of the democracy of the process, also going to allow if you want to generate some questions that don't fit within those 5 domains, that's also will be acceptable. We don't want to limit the potential questions that we get, and so this will be conducted in March, and we will get this out really quickly to all of you. Those questions, and there may well be 1,500 of them, will then be sort of kind of narrowed down to a more manageable list. Again, this will be done by the coordinating group and the advisory group, and again, just to make the process manageable. It will be, the decisions will be transparent, and there are ways in which we will be very happy, I think, as a group to share that entire list if necessary, but to try and again make it as transparent as possible. That list will be then in May sent out to, again, the same group that generated those questions for the scoring by those dimensions and within those dimensions and using those criteria. Once that's been done, we will then analyze the results, produce a final report, and that will be launched. There'll be a webinar launch, and that'll be launched at the forum in Cancun later in the year. And perhaps just a final point is within that, part of the analysis will be to really try and disaggregate those results, look at by geography and any other dimension that we believe to be key. So that's where we are. And then the final slide just gives you a process, the timeline of what we'd like to do, when we'd like to do that. As I said, with this launch at the forum in September. So yeah, thanks. Thanks, Anita.
Thanks so much, Mark. So now you have an overview of the process and what we have achieved so far. And now we have some time for questions from the group. You can feel free to either raise your hand using the little raise your hand option, or you can write it into the chat box, and we would be happy to discuss. So maybe while we wait for people to formulate their questions, if I can just say that signing up to the global stakeholder group is completely open globally and across the field for any stakeholders who are working to address these issues, because we are committed to an inclusive, participatory and democratic process. So I did put in the list the sign up link, and so you can share that and the link to the blog just for people to have some information to sign up, and we do encourage you to encourage your colleagues to weigh in. Does anybody have any clarifying questions? Sorry, Liz.
Maybe if we stop sharing the screen, we might be able to look at people and encourage people to ask us questions. Because the importance of this process really is around ensuring as many people participate as possible. I think that Patrick Reason has a question.
Mm-hmm. So Patrick has asked, how does the process eliminate bias on the mobilization of type of contributors? As in, if there are very many prevention folk who contribute. Mark, can you give inputs on that?
Mark, you're
muted.
Thought I would go the whole year without someone saying that to me. I think this was the first time. Patrick, thank you. It's a very good question. So again, that if the more people that respond, one of the questions you will be asked when you score, we will ask you what you do, where you're based. Do you see yourself as a prevention scientist, an NGO, or an advocate? And we'll ask you that. And one of the things we're able to do, again, obviously, the more we have, the better. We'll actually be able to disaggregate and see if you're a prevention scientist researcher. Like, what's the average score there? What does that come out? And how different might that be to implementers on the ground or to policymakers? And so we're able to disaggregate. It's not a foolproof way, but it does give some guide to be able to then say, is a particular group dominating? And so we will definitely do that.
If I can just add to that, you can see examples of how this was done in the Global Shared Research Agenda, which we've linked to earlier in the chat. I see there are 2 questions on language to enable participation from those who are not fluent in English. Yes, our intention is to have the survey available in different languages. And so at the moment, we are thinking about making sure that it's in English, Spanish, and French, but that is still under discussion, and we're working on different solutions for that.
Sophia has a question about we are very clear. We would love you to share it with NGOs. We really want as many different and diverse voices involved. Often research priority setting processes like market referred to as led by the most senior and the loudest in the room. And we want to try and avoid that through a more democratic and transparent process. So please share as widely as possible and get your colleagues to join in.
Thank you.
And maybe Liz, I could just add to that. I mean, we also need you as advocates for the process. Very often what happens is people think, and some of the questions by their nature will be somewhat technical, and they'll read a few and they say, like, I don't know about that method. But in fact, if you stop and think about it and think about the experience and how people get on the ground fed research results that they think, well, like, what's that got to do with me? If you just give it that shot, they'll realize how much they have to offer. And so again, we'll depend on the really keen people to encourage colleagues who may otherwise think, what do I know, to convince them that actually they do, and that their role, that their voice is really important here.
And I just want to add on to Mark's comments is that we did the Global Shared Research Agenda using a bit of an adaptation of the CHNRI model, and we had more practitioners than researchers answer do the research priority setting for us, which was really great. And we're doing it again in Latin America and the Caribbean, and again, many more NGOs, CBOs, women's rights organizations are engaging with the process, which is really fantastic, because I do think that people closest to the community within which we want research to serve need to have a voice in these processes.
I see Julia's raised a really important point. Does the framing of developing research questions risk to dissuade practitioners from participating who might not feel that they have sufficient research background to provide inputs? Yes, Julia, thank you so much for raising that. That is actually something that our team was discussing this morning after our morning session. And we are going to rephrase that to be more around, well, what questions is it that you want answered? What knowledge is that you would like to know more about? To make sure that it's far more openly worded and doesn't suggest that only researchers should be participating in that process. Then, okay, Sophia is suggesting that we also add Portuguese. Thank you so much. It's really helpful for us to hear what you would find really useful. So we will certainly add that to the list of when we are planning for that. How will the process involve the differential drivers and priorities for violence and LGBT? So the violence, we do want to take an intersectional lens, and so a lot of this depends on what research questions are submitted for prioritization. So the domains are intentionally extremely broad so that they can be inclusive. So please, if there are specific questions and intersectional focus questions, please include that. we may also see, if you don't feel like they fit into any of the domains, then please include it in the other section where you could add other questions so that we can make sure that that is well reflected in the process. Okay, moving
so
on.
The next question is about transdisciplinary research and engaging with people outside the field. And yes, we would love that. So I do think we have a responsibility as this group, the Global Expert Group, to really ensure that we get folk outside our groups to be engaging with this process, because we know, these complex, wicked problems can only be solved by multiple voices, and having multiple voices in processes like this ensure we have a better, stronger, more nuanced process output. So brilliant. I just want to check that I answered that question correctly. Kingsley?
Oh, hi, thank you for your answer. So you mentioned people outside the group for their input. Yeah, this question is about the people within the group. So we may have social scientists, physicians, and epidemiologists, also those social worker. They work in different opportunity or perspective of this intersection, violence against women and violence against children. So the blind people in the room, 7 days, can touch the big elephant with a report, a part of this elephant. So how we integrate those inputs within this group when they bring perspective from different disciplines. So this concept, the transdisciplinary research, really defined, I put it here, a shared conceptual framework so that synthesize, extend discipline-specific theory, concept, and methods. Has that been done in the previous process? How can we consider this in this process? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that input. Mark, did you want to respond to that? Because
I think it's a really good point. And maybe just to say is a couple of things. One is, this, just also to remember, this process is not going to solve, it's one process. And the most important thing is what actually happens after the process. What these get used for, who talks to whom using them. Even if it means looking at the appendix that's got the questions that didn't appear, but there's maybe some that are there. That really feels important. And equally, in terms of what gets scored, it really does depend on the questions, as Anik and Liz said, on the questions we get. So don't be shy to put those questions in, because the first step of going from those 2,000 questions is to, for example, get rid of all the ones that are repeated. And that's often the easiest part. You get rid of lots of repeats, and then you're down to manageable number. And then you're sitting with the difficulty of all these really interesting questions. But to keep it transparent, to keep it democratic, we cannot add questions at that point because, well, the organizing group thinks that's important. If we don't get it from you, it won't be in the list. So yeah, but such an important area. Thank you.
Thank you. Very helpful.
So thank you all for those questions, and also for your commitment to sharing it across your networks. That'll be very, very useful. And we've noted the request for Arabic and Portuguese to be added to the consideration for translation. We certainly will do that. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today and being with us for this 30 minutes brief overview of CHNRI, a very complex methodology, but very exciting. We have used it, and it's a powerful process, and it's fun. So please join us on this journey, because if we don't have your voices, we don't have diverse voices, if we don't reach outside to communities that aren't often involved in this process, we won't get the nuanced and wonderful product that we are looking for. So you are central. You're central to the success of this process. So we really look forward to receiving your research questions, and we really will invite you, as Anik's already said, to ask your colleagues to join the Global Expert Group. And we would like to remind you that that joining up the Global Expert Group is super important for us. And we're going to be sharing this recording, as well as a short frequently asked question answer sheet on the SRI webpage soon, so we'll share that with you. And then finally, I'd like to thank the team, and I'd like to thank Shanice for doing all the wonderful producing for us. And again, thank you for being part of this journey, and thanks for joining us. And we look forward to many more conversations with you.
Bye-bye,
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.